Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Keeping the Human Connection in a Hybrid Learning Environment. Our presenters today are David Wentworth, Principal Learning Analyst here at Brandon Hall Group, and Ben Lowell, Strategic Advisor at Class Technologies. Class is a live virtual learning platform that supports face-to-face learning at scale, enabling employees to learn with and from each other in a context-rich, active learning experiences. With collaboration, engagement, and reporting tools, Class reinvents virtual learning to drive outcomes that are meaningful to employees and create business impact. Founded in 2020 by education software pioneer Michael Chasen, Class Technologies is headquartered in Washington, D.C., with staff around the world. And I would like to take a moment to extend a thank you to Class Technologies for sponsoring today's webinar. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that we have several certification programs currently open for enrollment, including our Certified Learning Strategist program. You can visit certification.brandonhall.com for more information. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components of our research. So if you see any surveys on our schedule that you'd like to participate in, it's always greatly appreciated. All participants do receive a piece of complimentary research once the results have been analyzed. And you can visit our main website, brandonhall.com, and click on Open Surveys for the latest list. And last but certainly not least, we ask that you join in on our discussion today. Engage with our presenters, and please write your questions and comments in for our presenters to read and discuss with you on your control panel in the questions box. Our presenters will be keeping an eye on those throughout the presentation and will highlight them throughout. Any that we don't get to during the presentation will be answered at the end of the presentation during our Q&A segment. And without any further delay, I'll turn it over to Dave so we can dive right in.
All right, thank you so much, Melissa, for welcoming everyone, and we're so glad you were able to join us today. Yeah, please feel free to familiarize yourself with that question box. That's a great way to talk to Ben and I today and ask questions, and we'll be able to see those and try to answer relevant questions in real time as we go along, try to make everybody part of the conversation. We'll also squirrel away a little bit of time at the end to catch up with any questions we may miss or any new ones that come in at the end, so that's going to be your best bet for talking with us. You can also use that box to just share any thoughts, insights you might have. Doesn't have to be a question. That's the way you're going to communicate with us today. So obviously, we're going to focus a little bit on what's going on with the way learning has changed so dramatically in light of the current workforce dynamics. I think that, this idea that the workforce is a hybrid of people who work remotely and people who work on site is obviously not new. I've worked from a home office for an organization that has a main office for probably about 10 years now. And I think it's, not that uncommon. What has changed dramatically is the sheer volume of remote workers. Obviously, at the very beginnings of the pandemic, there was quite a lot more remote workers than there ever had been, because a lot of it was forced and it had to happen. Over the last couple of years or so, there's been a rollback where people are coming back to the office, and now we're starting to see, okay, the go forward it isn't that everything's going to go back to the way it was. There's now going to be this mix where that hybrid workforce represents a large enough contingent of employees that companies have to rethink how they work with their employee population in various ways, and of course, learning and development being key among them. And it's clearly important to talk about because we've seen in our research that 84% of organizations expect to have some sort of hybrid model in place where some people are remote, some people aren't, some people are both. They may be coming back and forth, very open-ended. You've even got situations where people are encouraged or allowed to work at different times now that they're remote. They could be working in the middle of the night if that's what works for them. So there's now not just geographical issues, but there's also these synchronous issues as well. As companies try to work their way through that. And, clearly an organization like Class, that's why we have Ben with us today, is their main focus is helping organizations, operate in this kind of environment and create tools that allow people to continue to work together, to collaborate in as an engaging and effective way as possible. So in one of our recent studies, we asked organizations, during this whole time, right, over these last couple of years, how successful have these kinds of digital tools been for learning when you're faced with this kind of workforce? And 85% gave things like WebEx or Zoom a 4 or a 5 on a level of success. So, either successful or highly successful. Same thing with Teams, but about 69%. And then the sort of more informal communication tools like a Slack or a Jabber, things like that, about 50% get that a successful or highly successful. So Ben, I think it's a good opportunity to come in and say hi, and let's talk about this a little bit, this explosion of the use of these kind of tools. And then clearly this is the kind of stuff we're going to unpack through this webinar as we go through, but I think, especially initially, we saw such an immediate turn from ILT, and I think our data shows something like 97% of companies did at least some in-person instructor-led training in 2019, and then all of a sudden you get to the middle of 2020 and that's basically evaporated.
Yeah, physical in-person was for the most part impossible, right? And it's quite a miracle that organizations were just able to function at all, with many of them never having done virtual learning, or if they had, a very small contingent of the business had been involved in virtual learning. So being able to communicate and function as a business when everybody's out of the office and in different locations is a real testament to just the grit of all of the organizations and the people involved. I think everybody felt the need to just be able to explore new options, and to the credit of the executives and leaders of these companies, they were like, hey, we have to do whatever it takes. And so the fact that all of these tools were in existence at the time, and people were like, hey, there's stuff we can use to communicate, to learn, to train, and it's really quite remarkable to see how successful we were in order to do this.
Yeah, and I think what I'd like you to sort of dig in a little bit too here as we move forward, because what we saw is, obviously organizations recognized that there were tools available to them. Like, okay, what do we do? But in the early days, the transition wasn't exactly smooth. I think there was a lot of missteps in moving from an in-person to a virtual approach without really much thought put towards, do we need to rethink the content? Do our facilitators have the right skills in a virtual environment? Do the tools we're using provide the right interactivity and engagement tools for a learning environment? And I think you talk about this a little bit, but obviously this is kind of the expertise of how do we design for that kind of environment.
Absolutely, yeah. In the moment, it was do first, think later, right? We didn't have the luxury of having a great strategy in place. Most organizations didn't. Maybe there were a few that kind of saw something coming, but most probably weren't prepared. So it was, we just have to take action, and then we can evaluate and analyze as we go. Fly the plane as we're building it. And over that time, what we were able to notice is really there's 3 clear audiences as far as where the employees are working. Right? You have an office, and they're in an office, and sometimes they are at home, and then other times they're at a satellite office, or maybe a co-office WeWork type situation where you've got different employees from different companies represented in the same building. So now, as time's passed, we can now evaluate and decide where are the employees going to be, and how do we consider the location and how that's going to impact their ability to learn. And so being aware, I think the pictures are representative of like work from home, right? You got the kids, I've got the dogs behind me, I've got, doorbells ringing and people coming. So you have to be considerate of the environment in which your employees are spaced. And so thinking of all of that first and understanding that, I think, is a really important step into the design process.
Yeah, agreed. So, and taking that into consideration, then you start to get into, what are the technology needs, because that first bit isn't just about learning, obviously, right? I think we saw that in some of the work that we did over the last couple of years, is organizations really had to figure out, what does work mean for folks who are in these different areas. You know, that those environments have an impact on all work aspects, not just learning. And so it's been a learning curve for the organization to figure out, what do people need to be successful in these environments, and then how, as we start to think through what does learning look like now that this is our new reality, how do we approach it in a way that helps the learner but doesn't add to maybe any of the chaos or the burden that there might be with these other new different technology approaches for other parts, like where they just do their job, or core HR, other systems and other parts of the business that they're interacting with. You know, we don't want it to become burdensome simply because people are working now not in the building. So what we saw in the research is that 42% of companies, which is actually pretty high when you think about what we're asking, is based on what has happened as a result of the pandemic in your organization, do you plan to purchase or upgrade any technology? You know, this study was done in 2021, so you know, we're in it, and 42% of companies said, yeah, we're making plans to either upgrade what we're currently using because it's not meeting our needs, or we're looking for something new because our needs have changed. And you know, it's pretty dramatic to think about that. Even with all the progress that the learning ecosystem has made from a technological standpoint over the years, that a lot of organizations feel as though they're not prepared for this particular environment, and so they need some technological help to make this work, which, you know, makes sense given that now people are not in the same building anymore, and it means a lot of different things around coordination and connectivity and accessibility. So there's a lot of tools that are available and could possibly be part of the that environment. And so Ben, why don't you talk a little bit about, you know, what sort of goes into this thought process of what kind of technology are we talking about?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, communication techniques. If you had a business that was still communicating almost exclusively via email, that becomes very challenging when you're trying to work in real time with other groups of your business. And so, you know, tools where you can have instant communication chats, group chats, so Slack and Jabber and Teams and other G Suite tools that are enabling the communication beyond just regular email. And a lot of organizations had these types of tools, but maybe they weren't using them in every department, or they weren't using them to their fullest extent. So just being able to communicate in real time on projects and collaborate, now that you're not, you know, in an office and we can just gather in a conference room, could be difficult, especially when you can't just sit in a conference room for 8 hours a day, right? We're not going to sit on Zoom or Teams necessarily for that amount of time either. So we have to have some asynchronous communication abilities in addition to the synchronous. Other business tools, you know, CRMs. I think a lot of companies, sales, especially departments, had CRMs and tools to track customer interactions and prospects and clients. But the need to be able to communicate about these changed, because I can't just go over to the department and talk to them in person. So we had to become more efficient using these technologies. I think it's beyond just the tech stack itself, but it's like being better at using the tech stack and knowing more of the nuances. It's not that we're going to use 10% of the tool. It's like we need to learn how to use 100% of the tool and how that can facilitate our processes as we move forward. And of course, HR would expand that as well. So having additional tools for analytics and understanding, are people happy? You know, HR, especially today, people departments, they want to know that employees are safe and happy. And during the pandemic, I mean, we saw all sorts of craziness ensue. Obviously, physical disease was upon us, but then we have a lot of issues with mental illness and emotional distress, and just becoming, I mean, we're all cooped up in our houses, and it's really difficult to understand what those the policies that were put in place, how that was going to affect you know, an entire world of people. And so HR departments were tasked with, how do we benefit our companies and our employees? And so I think it brought a whole new awareness to emotional health and mental health in organizations because we were so disconnected. And it was such a rapid change and shift that it had to be really quick. So understanding, people's sentiment, doing engagement surveys, and really reaching out and having the analytics behind not just employee sentiment, but also employee productivity. It's very helpful to have it. So anyways, there's a dozen categories we could go into as far as business tools, but I think the main key is having the technology and understanding the fullness of that technology, understanding how that will impact an organization positively was critical.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's a key thing, especially, when we think back to this data I just showed about upgrading or purchasing new technology in light of what's happening. I think the first piece of feedback we usually give as when we consult organizations on these kinds of transformations is what do you currently have, and are you using it to its fullest capabilities, and does it have capabilities that you might not have needed before but you might need now that exist and you're just not aware of them or how to use them. So it's really important to take that inventory of what do we have and what can we leverage before we start to freak out.
Yeah, we chat a lot of times with CTOs and CIOs, and their strategy is how do we streamline the options available within an organization, and how do we not have duplicative softwares, right? It turns out like you have departments buying different softwares all the time, and then as you see a large swath of softwares that maybe do a lot of the same thing, and there's a lot of crossover. So it was important to try to streamline those efforts internally so that everybody was using similar tools and had a similar process to achieve the same goal. So
yeah, like you list out some of these items here, this comms and communication, these different tools, and you think about each piece of the business, whether it's a business unit, a function, a geography, and then you think about like HR and the different kind of columns within that, and all of the different technologies that they have available to them, and each one of them most likely has some sort of communication channel built into it. So then it's okay, well, what becomes the communication of record? How do we get everyone talking in the right place at the right time on the same thing? And it can be very challenging because all of these different tools, as you mentioned, the overlap, they all want to do some of what the other ones do. It's a question of what makes the most sense for your organization, where this makes sense to be our main communication channel. Let's use that, and then for certain things we use others. But again, making an inventory, understanding what's available to you and what they do is very critical. Tracy makes the comment that their workforce knows of the tools, but they use them in a very limited way, and that is actually slowing down the capability to connect in real time. There's a lot of uncertainty. So not only is it an internal awareness of what's available and what should be used, but then communicating that out to get everybody on the same page to say, look, this is how we're going to do this, and stay together.
Completely, yeah. Software enablement is a critical component. Like having software is not the solution, right? Knowing how to effectively use the software with really smart and intelligent strategies, that will make a difference. But just by virtue of having the software doesn't solve any problems. Like software itself doesn't solve issues. And I work for a software company, and that's one of my mantras is technology does not solve your problems. People do, and smart strategies that are implemented well will solve. And so the technology can be part of your solution as long as it's rolled out well. Our company was founded during the pandemic, so we're 100% remote, and we have been since day one. And I've never been in an organization that is 100% remote. And we have a lot of challenges with communication, I think, as does any company. But the other thing we're not facing is the habits of communication that have been built up over decades, right? So for us, we have challenges, but an organization that's been around for 50 years that has been doing this the same way for 50 years and is now trying to address these challenges and come up with solutions, it's even harder because we have to, veer the entire ship. Whereas, some of these earlier startups who have a remote population and have had for a long time, those changes might be a little bit easier to adopt, but it's still challenging. So kudos to any organization that has massive, that's been around for a while and has really committed to making these successful, because that's a big ask to try to get an entire organization like that with decades of habits and rituals for communication and collaboration, and then just overall productivity, to say like we have to change everything and we have to do it now. That's a huge feat. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, the thing that is really striking for a lot of companies is it isn't so much of, here's what we did when we were in person, and here are some technologies that will allow us to do these things now that we're remote, or whatever the environment may look like, is that, we can't, how do we replicate the things that were just sort of inherent in being in person, right? There's things that weren't even taken into consideration because they just exist when people are in a room. That sort of connectivity, that the communication that happens, the nonverbal visual cues, things like that, that just are taken for granted. So then you strip that away and you put people in a virtual environment, and you have to consider those things. It isn't just a lift, like, let's take what we did here and we'll do it virtually. There's a whole lot of other stuff that goes with it. And so, one of the things we asked in one of our studies was, what are you doing in the cases where you can't do instructor-led training anymore? And as well as, if as we start to move away from more formalized LMS courses, what are some of the experiential and informal learning types that you're using as a replacement? Trying the different types of experiences you're creating and putting out there. And so we see a big reliance on coaching and mentoring. Really, that feeds very much into the whole keeping people connected, collaborating, so there isn't, this feeling of isolation, and that people continue to be connected. Coaching and mentoring works really well for that, especially in a learning environment. Peer-to-peer learning, again, keeping people connected, learning from one another. Stretch assignments is more of an experiential thing, like, let's put people into situations where they can try something outside their comfort zone, or outside of their current role, and see what they can learn from that. Simulations and role play, more of that learning by doing. So there's just a lot of different opportunities and modalities and technologies that are out there that companies are turning to, much more than they had in the past, because simply, they've been forced to. Like, my organization's been talking about all these different types of learning for years, and why they're beneficial and how they work and how they fit in with everything else, not necessarily as a replacement. And organizations get it, but as you said, it's very hard to turn the whole ship. And then suddenly, the pandemic comes along and makes it happen instantly. And so now, as companies try to figure out what the plan is going forward, instead of just completely going back to the way things were, let's just do everything back in the classroom, let's explore more rigorously these different types of opportunities that we can use to leverage in a remote hybrid environment.
Certainly. Yeah, it's really quite interesting. Like you mentioned, you've been talking about these for a long time. I think, LMS tools have been around over 2 decades now, and so they're not necessarily new, but they haven't necessarily scaled across an entire organization for all elements of learning. And that's specific to asynchronous. Now, when we're talking about synchronous learning, virtual learning classrooms came about, at least, 12, 13, 14 years ago for the first time that I'm aware of, and that were being used. But again, weren't scaling usually across an entire organization. It was more niche or very, targeted use cases. And so even if those tools existed, being able to understand that they existed in an organization and then scale that across every audience, that's challenging. And you can't just plug and play. You can't just take a live in-person training and just immediately convert that to virtual and expect it to go smooth or perfectly. It is a different dynamic. And like you said, we take for granted some of the benefits of being in person that are just inherent in the experience. We have to find creative ways to replicate or to have similar experiences in the virtual space. And it's just not a given that will happen. And so there's a lot of consideration that goes into it. So love that.
Yep. And some of the challenges that companies say that they face in doing this, trying to create an engaging learning experience in a hybrid environment, both developing the content and the programs and then delivering them. What we see is it has a lot to do with time. Or organizations just simply find that it's hard. Like, the learning function says that they don't necessarily have the time they need, especially when it comes to developing, right, which is the lighter blue. 54%, so that's their biggest issue is we just don't have enough time to develop that kind of program. From a delivery standpoint, the number one thing becomes that the learners have too many demands on their time, right? So it's like, how do we get this learning to them in a way that makes sense? And we know that they have a lot of demands on their time and a lot of different things that are vying for their attention. How do we get in there? And then, you can see also budget constraints is much more of a that and headcount. Those are much more of developing challenges versus delivery. You definitely need more, people and resources to create the programs than necessarily to deliver them, which is typically going to be, a technology solution, but gives you some idea of what some of the challenges are in this environment for sure. But at the end of it all, as we start to look at what's happening, we asked, okay, moving forward, what are you going to be doing? And it's hard to say, like, I can't say that now that the pandemic's over, because it's not, or when the pandemic is over, because we don't know, but various parts of the world are in different stages of things. And so all we can do is talk about how we're going to continue to move forward. And right now, when we ask, how frequently will you be using these different things, whether it's virtual instructor-led training, live instructor-led training, or the hybrid synchronous, both remote and in person at the same time, we see that the virtual instructor-led training is going to lead the day. In 63% say they're going to use that consistently or frequently, but we do see that there will be, live in-person instructor-led training as well, probably not to the degree that there used to be. So that's something to consider. But we do see, and I thought this was interesting, and Ben, I don't know your take on this, and I think we want to dig into this a bit, is the 44% saying that they're going to consistently or frequently use that hybrid synchronous, both remote and in-person model moving forward.
That's interesting. Yeah, I understand the impact of this. Virtual learning, again, it's been around for at least a decade, and doing that in a live setting, but not necessarily super widespread. And I think a lot of leaders were worried, even learning leaders were worried that would be an effective mode of training and to deliver the right kind of outcomes. And during the pandemic, we were forced to, and so there's like, hey, actually, we see the future of this. This is actually can be a successful model. The virtual learning experience doesn't have to be a lesser than experience. There are moments when it makes sense to be in person, and we benefit from the associations that are formed and the communication that can happen in person, but we don't have to rely 100% on that. And leaders see that, they're like, wow, we can save money, we can be more efficient if we have multiple options. And then you have this at the bottom where we're like, well, what if we can make that experience better when we have people who are remote and in person? I think this is a place where it's really difficult. When we talk about hybrid work, I like to really clarify. Hybrid work to me represents the fact that we have people who are in an office and people who are remote, and oftentimes at the same time, and very often now, those people are shifting. Sometimes they're in office, sometimes they're remote, sometimes they're in office. So it's not always the same population. Before it used to be, if you were remote, you were always 100% remote unless you were visiting the office 1 week out of the year, right? Now it's like, oh, well, we have people who are in office, we have people who are remote. So the idea of like, how do we combine these two populations in the same session is only natural to have. So far, my experience with this, and according to a lot of the articles and research that's being provided, is that's not a very good experience for most learners. If we're trying to combine those who are in person and those who are remote and have those two experiences simultaneous, it gets very difficult to manage. And at least for now, almost inevitably, the people who are remote feel left out, don't necessarily feel included. And so it can be a really non-inclusive experience, unfortunately. So my advice to most organizations is try to avoid that as much as possible in the learning space when you can. If it's presentational, that's a little bit different, right? Because we're just consuming information in those environments. But if we're really trying to have good learning experiences and organize it that way, it tends to create some inequity. So the recommendation I have is that try the best you can to have, when they're in person, train those people exclusively, and then when you have remote employees, do that. If you have to combine, a lot of organizations are saying, actually, it's better that everybody is remote. If you have a population in office and you have a population remote, push everybody to remote. That way it doesn't create any sort of a bias or inequity amongst those groups. So that's what I'm hearing, that's what I'm seeing, and from my experience, I feel like that's the most effective until better technology is out or other tools and potential comes out that I've seen. But I don't know what your thoughts are, but that's kind of what I've seen.
No, I would agree. I mean, it was just personal anecdote. I have two young daughters who are in school, and witnessing what was happening in their schools as some students were still going to school and some were remote, and watching the teachers try to manage that, and it was a disaster. Now, that was early on and nobody really had much experience. It's been a couple of years, and we're also talking about corporate learning, so there's just a little bit of a different dynamic as far as the learners go, obviously. And I think it's a much better proposition than it was. But I agree with you about the challenges they face. And so if you do want to do this, and there are organizations doing it, we've actually, for our case studies, we've started to pull some for this current awards season because it's so new. We hadn't had it before, and so we don't have them yet, but we're starting to get submissions around this type of learning where we're doing both remote and in person at the same time. My takeaway is that if you are going to do it, then the focus doesn't sort of have to be on the remote learners in the sense that, what are we doing to make sure that they're not shut out or feel shut out? Is everyone sort of on the same page from a technology standpoint, even those folks that are in person? Are we communicating through the same channels? Are we using smaller groups? And if we're breaking up groups, are we including remote and in-person people in those groups to keep that connectivity going? Yeah, I think that's really the big issue. And like you said, make everyone remote. Let's be honest. You think about people working, and I know this isn't every organization, but it's the generic organization that people think about is a bunch of people in an office building sitting at desks, right? Even in that situation, if everyone's in the same building, a lot of the work people are doing is virtual.
Yeah,
they're collaborating, communicating, connecting from their desk. They're not going and actually sitting with those people. So most people have been doing this for a long time anyway. So the idea of, hey, we're going to do this program, but rather than this group of people going down the hall into this room, just do it from where you are. Exactly. So we can include everybody else. But
and if that's not an option, the other choice I would offer is that the facilitator or the facilitator groups would be remote. Even if they're there in the physical space with those who are gathered in a room or a couple of conference rooms, my preference then would be, the secondary preference would be, at least the facilitator is remote, so that they still have to address everybody the same way and associate with everybody the same way. So if you have a little group of 5 that are in a conference room, or 20, that's fine. But if the facilitator's there with that audience, it really can kind of tip the balance and feel like they're showing some favoritism. So I like the idea of having the facilitator or teacher just sitting in a room or at their desk and facilitating to the full group in a remote setting. So it definitely can happen, and I'm excited to see. I would be curious to see the awards you're coming up with and people are submitting, because I know there's a lot of successful ways to deliver that, or there will be. I'm waiting to learn more, I guess.
And Kevin in the audience makes the point that the balance experience between in-room and remote is a challenge, but there are technologies available to make that happen clearly. And I think that's part of why we have you here, Ben, to talk about that. Is part of your expertise, but for sure, and that's what we're talking about, is it is possible. It just takes some extra thoughts and considerations. And Sonia was actually asking for a little bit more definition around hybrid, and depending on what we're talking about. If we're talking about the workforce, when we say hybrid workforce, then clearly we're talking about, you've got an organization where there's a contingent of workers who are all in the same location, in the same building, and then there's a contingent of people who are in their own home offices by themselves. Or it could also be what you described, that there's satellite offices as well. But if you think about it, people are in this office, people are in that office, they're still together. In our minds, we're talking about the remote workforce. We're talking about one that includes a large contingent of people who are working at home or by themselves in some location that is not in the office.
That would be
from a learning perspective. I just want to make the clarification too, that from the learning perspective, when we talk about hybrid, in this context, we specifically mean asynchronous. Like, the learning itself is synchronous. Hybrid meaning people are remote, people are in place. The approach to learning that you take for a hybrid workforce can include any and all things, right? It can be all these other informal, experiential, formal things that we're talking about. But go ahead, Ben.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah, the clarification is exactly that that hybrid learning is now, like I said, in a synchronous environment where we have people who are in person with the teacher, with the facilitator, and those who are remote, and we're all in the same session together. That's what we talk about as hybrid, a hybrid audience or hybrid learning experience. Again, that's a lot of times comes up. So I'm just saying, like, that it's in and of itself is not my first preference.
Right.
As far as creating a hybrid where we have sometimes where we're in person and we're doing learning, and then sometimes where we're doing remote learning, that is a hybrid learning strategy, right? Where we're mixing up modalities and different approaches to learning. That's great. So I want people to be clear, like I love mixing it up, but if we can, my preference is trying to avoid the multiple sessions where we got a lot of people in the office and then a lot of people remote, and we're trying to learn all at the same time in a synchronous environment. That's just a really challenging experience. So, and sometimes it can't be avoided, and I totally understand that. But
yep.
That wouldn't be my #1 preference for the way I would want to carry out a course.
And it sort of leads us, into a question, which actually then leads us into this next bit of data here. Is Terry's asking, if they ever consider, or their organization considers going strictly ILT again, in-person instructor-led training, how do you consider the person who still does not feel comfortable coming back to the office for training? And I think that is something at that stage, if you're in an organization and you're made this decision where we're going to back, that's something you have to determine pretty much on a case-by-case basis. Unless you've got enough people who are not going to come in for the training, where then you have to think about what all the things Ben was just talking about is, okay, then we may be forced into taking this hybrid synchronous approach. And then you really have to think about how best are we going to do that. It really just depends, though, on your organization, your organization's culture, how strongly you feel about whether or not people should or need to come in physically for particular training, and that is going to be a program by program basis. That's going to be an employee by employee basis. It's something that you're going to have to try to work out and figure out.
Yeah, and if you have a large contingent that it has to be ILT in person, that happened before, and people were absent or they were on vacation or missing the class. So even before the remote thing was a big deal and people were all over the place, we had to find ways to train those who were not present at that training. So there had to be cliff notes, or there had to be a recording, or there had to be something that we could share with those who were absent. So that's one way to consider moving forward. If 95% or 100% of your trainings are going to be live in-person ILT, you still have to have a plan to address those who are not there because they're out of work for whatever reason. So if you do have a few employees that are remote because they can't come back to work, then you have to create a plan for them anyways, just like you would have before. So it's just considering the people that are on vacation or out sick, and finding a very effective way to make sure they have the same access to the information and training.
Yeah, and this is just showing here that this is the situation we're in. This study was done at the beginning of this year, 2022, and you can see there's still plenty of in-person instructor-led training going on. I mean, for almost half of organizations, they say that still half of or more of their learning is in person now. So obviously, we can't say whether or not 2 years ago they had none, which is probably likely, but you can see where things are. It's not to the levels that it was prior, but clearly still a huge part of the learning experience is going to be these in-person instructor-led training. So you have to start to think about these things. What about the fact that we may have people who do not come in or cannot come in? How do we address that? And so those are the things that you're talking about. And I think before we just jump into some of the considerations as you start to put this strategy together and some of the things you can think about, the last piece of data, and I just thought was interesting, we asked, okay, well, what is the L&D team? What's most important to the L&D function when you start to think about this hybrid work environment, how we're going to best deliver learning in this environment? And we gave just two options for this particular question. And it was either, do you choose some new technologies to get it done, or do we retrain the learning organization? And you can see it's 63% said it's really about the skills and competencies that exist within the learning organization. How do we, as a function, strategize and approach this new dynamic workforce? then maybe perhaps we can worry about the technology. And that's exactly what you were saying earlier, Ben, right? And I've said the same thing many times, is that, technology rarely solves an issue, right? And until you've got everything else figured out, all technology will do, like if your people and processes are wrong, all technology will do will make those wrong things happen faster and at a much larger scale. So yeah, I think it's interesting to know that organizations recognize they may need some new skills in the L&D team to manage this kind of environment.
Yeah, David, I don't know if that slide was being shown, the 63%.
Oh wait,
if it was,
yeah,
great. I have it on there. So there we go. Yeah,
you got stuck.
I'm seeing it. Maybe everybody else saw it before, but yeah, this is exactly what Dave was talking about. The concept that again, the technology is not going to fix it. We have to have smart people. We have to have people who are well trained. And then once you have the good strategy and smart, intelligent people who are well trained, then you can implement softwares that will enable your strategy to work more effectively. But just like you said, if you just put a software in place, but you have the wrong strategy, you're just going to propel the wrong strategy quicker, and it's not really going to help. So, and then it just becomes a waste of money and shelfware, which is a problem. So,
so let's dig into some of the considerations moving forward. And I think some of these may help Tracy's get the question about, accounting for hybrid audiences in our learning strategies. How do we create a strategy? Do we create a strategy and then fit that, fit the hybrid audiences into that appropriately, or should hybrid audiences be a driving force? And so my answer to that, Tracy, it really depends on specifically your organization. You have to take stock of what your workforce dynamic is. What's the level of remote workers that you have? What percentage of that is representative of the entire workforce? And so you get a sense of scale of, if you're just talking about a handful of people, it may change the way you approach that versus half of your organization is remote, right? And how much of a driving factor that is and how you create the strategy and how you address them. So it's really about that. And also once you've identified, okay, what percentage of the workforce is remote, then amongst that group, how often can we get those people to come in person if we want or need them to, taking the temperature on that. And then you start to get a sense of when and where you can do what. Like you can get the sense of, hey, it is possible for really key initiatives. We could have a big get together learning program and people will come in for it. And we can do it that way, and then everything else. But you have to take an inventory of what you've got at hand.
I totally agree with that. I'll give you an example. We've seen organizations that have done this where you have, okay, let's say you got 30 people and 25 of them are in person in the same place with the facilitator, and then there's 5 who are remote in different locations, whether they're at their home office or at a satellite office, doesn't matter. They're all on a Zoom or some remote tool. What I've seen that I think can be very successful and creative is everybody's participating with the facilitator, but when we do like smaller breakout activities, and we can really do this well, you can have a second facilitator who is in the remote group or breakout room alone with them, so really guiding that conversation. And then they have the core facilitator who's with the audience who's in person. So I think that's a great way to address the needs of the two audiences, where it will feel more like we're not being left out, and we have some dedicated attention. Have an additional facilitator or an expert who can really run the session with that remote audience more effectively. When the presentation needs to happen, everybody's together, but when there's dialogue and conversation happening, like break into those smaller groups and have a facilitator be prepared to run that audience. I've seen that work effectively, and I think it addresses some of those main concerns. So
yeah. And I think, and you may get into this here in a minute as we talk through some of these, but I think the other thing to consider is the what happens after, right? We're very focused on this class, and is it a hybrid? Are we delivering synchronous classroom for both? And if that's the case, I think then what's really important is how are we following up? And follow up is important for any learning in any environment, right? Well, how are we keeping it fresh, reinforcing it, and that sort of thing. So doing it in a way that everyone, whether they were in person or remote, their follow-up group, their little cohort, they're able to discuss probably virtually through a platform, so then everyone's equal. And then those folks that maybe weren't there, if they feel they missed something, they can get that from their cohorts, or even vice versa. But it helps, bring everyone together, follow up, and then by, with informal learning discussion and so forth, they start to all come on the same page pretty quickly.
Definitely. There has to be a lot of coordination after the course. And like you're saying, those tools will make it easier. So I completely agree there.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I may, I wanted to throw in this just kind of an anecdote to help us kind of settle down a little bit. Like there's so much happening in a learning organization, and especially over the last 2 years, just I feel like most professionals have just been overworked and trying to make this all work, and they're all working hard. I mean, everybody I've ever worked with in learning teams are just, they care so much about their purpose and helping people become better and improve the organization overall. And it can be exhausting if that's not recognized, and it can also be exhausting when it doesn't feel like it's working well. So I just want to throw this anecdote out. There's this concept of marginal gains that often comes up, and one of the best illustrations I've ever seen of this is a story about the British cycling team. So really for like many years, I think over 100 years, the British cycling team had only won 1 gold medal in 100 years. And in 2003, Dave Brailsford, he took over the team, and he had this concept, and I'm going to read this quote that he said. He said, if you break down every little aspect of cycling and improve each by 1%, the final result would be significantly different. That was his whole concept. So this concept of 1% and marginal gains. And what ended up happening is in 2004, the year after, they won some medals, but they didn't do what they needed, right? But in 2008, Britain won 8 gold medals in cycling. And then again in 2012, they won 8 more gold medals. The concept of 1% incremental gains in each aspect, that's achievable. That's something that a learning organization can do and provide. And so the concepts that I want to present here, it's not like, hey, you have to change everything you're doing. It's consider where you can make a 1% gain. And hopefully these concepts and these tips, these aren't new. This isn't like revolutionary, but I wanted to present these ideas because I think if we focus on them, everybody will be able to find a little bit of improvement in some of these smaller areas. And those small improvements may seem small, but when you add them up, it actually can make a massive change and difference, just like the cycling team. So hopefully that gives people a lot of courage to say like, hey, you know, it's okay if we're not changing the world overnight. Like that's all right. And sometimes we feel that as, you know, learning professionals, we want to impact and we want to change the world. So I want to talk about that. So the first one is really be considerate of people's time. We saw in your data, David, that time was a huge issue. Not only time to provide training, but then time that conflicted with the employees themselves and getting work done. So productivity in an organization is number one and will always be number one. That's important. But if we can really partner with the leaders, the business leaders of every area, and we can make sure that they understand that how these small amounts of training will really have those incremental gains and create marginal gains in their departments. We have to build that trust with them that that's what's actually going to be delivered. So being efficient with every minute that's utilized in training. Don't waste people's time. That's like cardinal sin number one as a facilitator is don't waste time. And I've been in too many trainings that were 8 hours a day for 7 days, 5 days a week, 3 weeks at a time, where it felt like there was a lot of time wasted. And business leaders see that. So do not, respect people's time, and business leaders specifically, do not ask for things unless you feel like it really will make a difference. Otherwise, you don't take it, right? Don't err on the side of, well, we need extra time. Err on the side of we need less time. And then if we feel like it's doing well and we need more and they're asking for more, great, let's give them more. So that's kind of the number one. It's like, make sure you're using the best of everybody's time. The second one is focus on facilitation and not teaching, right? I don't know if this is a generational thing specifically, but it feels like the way that professors and teachers and corporate trainers worked, a long time ago was all presentational. The teacher was the expert and they would just impart their wisdom 100% of the time to students. And I'm not saying all teachers and all professors have done that over time, but that was a very common practice, and still we see it too much. What I believe is more effective is more the Socratic method, where we're using questions and we're using the curiosity of learners to really build learning experiences. So my advice as a facilitator is that create a place where learning can occur and where the learners can become curious enough to discover what they need to know. As opposed to saying, I'm going to teach you and you're going to learn it no matter, because I've got all this wisdom. That's not as effective method as letting people self-discover. And so as a facilitator, you want to let that happen. David, go ahead. It sounded like you looked like you maybe had something to add in there.
Oh, just it really speaks to the challenge that we've been addressing here is, well, how do we take this? We've been doing all this ILT. Most of our stuff has been ILT for decades. How do we suddenly make it virtual? It's like, well, what were you really doing in those in-person sessions? And if it's that sage on the stage you described, which it typically is, where a person is disseminating information, that's the wrong forum for that. You don't need to be in person for that. You could do that virtually. You could have done that virtually 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And had far more effectiveness. If you were going to, and you talk about time, if you're going to make that ask of the organization, hey, give me these people's time. And then you're going to ask of the people, hey, give me your time. And we're going to pull you all together, whether it's just down the hall in a room, or we're actually going to fly people from all over for a couple of days. Think of all the time, money, and energy that takes, and then you're just going to talk at them. It's complete waste. And then if you factor in things like the Ebbinghaus curve or just common sense, within a week after that, all of that you've put in there, within a week after that kind of learning event, they're going to forget most of it.
Yeah, it's not very effective as a learning method, and two, it's not a long-term solution because so much information is lost. So the best way to unlock good results in education is the learners have to be committed, and the self-discovery process is the best impact for learning that will change behaviors and actually improve outcomes. So I completely agree. The third thing here is making sure your content has activity built into it, right? Again, this is kind of back to the, I'm not just going to sit and present for an hour. I want activity, right? And so the more activity you can have with those learners, the better. The concept here is also adapt and deploy quickly. You have to be able to adapt your content very fast to the environment. We have so many changing priorities in businesses today. Things happen rapidly. And so we can't spend 3 months on a learning cycle when the outcomes have to be delivered much quicker, right? We have to really deliver quickly the content, the material. So sometimes it's not going to be super polished, but at least we should know that the outcomes are going to be high. And so, make sure that there's activity built in. When I used to teach junior high, and we had the district supervisor over physical education would come and talk to all the teachers and teach them and say, build physical activity into your lessons. And his science base, it was all science based. He said, the brain needs activity to function. So even standing up in the middle of your class and doing jumping jacks, or spinning around, doing something active with your body will enhance the learning experience. And so you can do that in a virtual setting. You can be creative and come up with ways to make sure they are being active. Anyways, and then the fourth thing is blending the modalities. We talked about this. There are moments when in-person learning makes 100%. And there are other times it doesn't. The flipped classroom idea has been around for decades now. It's brilliant. If it's lecture, send the lecture and let people consume it at their own rate, at their own pace, and then come together to really discuss that conversation. Have a conversation and dialogue around the material, as opposed to just having the whole in-person time focused on lecture, present, and then nothing happens as a follow-up. There's no conversation. Learning is going to occur much faster when you're working with peers and other people in conversation and discussion and really thinking about and questioning the concepts that are there. That's where real learning occurs, and that's when you unlock the potential for learning overall. So make sure you're mixing it up, have different activities built in, and don't kill people by lecture and by PowerPoint. Death by PowerPoint, you've heard that too much. I don't know, any comments, David? Any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I just think it's spot on, and that idea of pre-work, the idea of, if it is going to be a lecture of some kind, well, give it to them previously, whether a video or some reading, what happens, and that way, when you do decide you're going to get people together in person or even virtually, but if they do something like this prior, now when they do get together, whether it's in person, virtual, or combination, everyone's essentially on the same page, as opposed to if you're going to disseminate that information in that event, you have to spend the time to get people to the same page before they're able to even communicate, collaborate, discuss. So you've missed an opportunity again of you've brought people together probably at the wrong time. And you could have done some stuff beforehand to get them on the same page, then have the actual synchronous piece of the learning. And then there's the sort of on-demand follow-up discussion reinforcement that goes on after it. So it's really the idea of, what's the trajectory? How do we want to make the best use of everyone's time? I think that's a great insight that you have here for the strategies. But yeah, I think that brings us through to the Q&A, and we're at a good time for it. There were a couple of questions that came in that I flagged actually for this time because they were a little bit broader. One was, what's the best way to, this one, Teresa, this is a huge question. Maybe we can give a quick answer, but this is the best way to skill the workforce up on all the technology and the best ways to use them and have them continuously use these tools to their full capabilities. I mean, yeah, so that's sort of like it's a technology adoption question. And yeah, to me, it's about minimizing that footprint as much as possible. So we're not creating, here's 12 new technologies that you need to get your job done. It's more of, hey, here's how we're going to use this thing you're already familiar with, and we're going to use it in this way, or you're going to use it to access this other thing, and just demonstrate how these tools and technologies connect to their workflow and help them do their jobs better, even if it is a separate learning platform that they have to use for a certain thing. Say, this is why, and this is what how it's going to help. And you need to communicate clearly and often about the importance of it. You need to have model the behavior, so people have to model it, especially the leadership. And then use great examples of something that came out of that technology. So they said, hey, look, last week when this happened, it happened on this platform, and this is how it happened, and it was great, and here's why. Things like that. If you have any other thoughts.
I think frequent enablement, do as many sessions as you can, and make sure it's relevant. If I'm going to use the software one time in a month, guess what? Doing an hour-long training on it, I'm probably going to forget a bunch of that because it's not immediately going into application. So consider like how frequently the end user is going to be utilizing that technology, and then create a strategy around that. Because if I don't use it on a daily basis, guess what? If you train me on the whole software once and then I don't touch it for 30 days, it's gone. I'm not going to remember it. So you really have to consider the audience, how frequently they're using, and if they're using it sparingly, then create a different set of resources for them to go and find when they need it. Right? But if they're using it often, great, just continuously do enablement sessions ongoing. And like you said, David, show successful usage of it, right? Examples of this is how you can be creative or successful using the software, and do that ongoing.
Yep. Here's what I'll just let you take a crack at it, because we could probably do an hour on it, but I think you probably have some good thoughts on this. Please compare the benefits of live online and asynchronous e-learning. And I think there's a lot of pro-con that you could do on that.
Live online, synchronous learning versus asynchronous. To me, I feel like they're just part of a strategy. Like we talked about Khan Academy or the flipped classroom, there are a lot of materials that can be shared and done asynchronously, because I can learn on my own at my own pace, and I don't have to wait for everybody else. Plus, we talked about employees might be working at midnight, some might be working at 6 a.m. So do it when they have time. So that's why asynchronous can be so helpful. To me, asynchronous is supporting and helping the synchronous, and vice versa. Like, they really work in tandem. They shouldn't be competing. Like, it's all part of the same strategy. Right. So anytime we feel like, oh, well, asynchronous is better or live is better, no, they both are part of the whole. Like, you need both of them. And you should employ them both as frequently as possible where it makes sense. Together. They shouldn't compete.
No, and I've been doing, like I said, I've been here at Brandon Hall Group for now 10 years, and we've been studying this kind of stuff, and I've watched all these technologies emerge, and never once have I said X is going to replace Y. It's, oh, here's something new you can do in addition to. Here's how you can, pull this in. I think the only thing I saw got replaced was the CD-ROM. And,
Yeah.
But the reality is it isn't about, oh, you can do this instead of classroom now. It's, you know, how does this support the classroom, and then how does this allow us to take a different approach to an in-person classroom, and how do we make it more strategic, more engaging, more collaborative? So it's really about how all these things work together, for sure. And then that actually brings us to another question about the challenge, and we talked about pre-work, the challenge of chunking the pre-work down so that people have time, you know, making sure that it gets completed before the actual work session. You know, people are so busy. But the answer to that question lies in just what we were saying. It isn't just about the pre-work, it's about learning overall. How do we look at what the things that we're trying to deliver via learning, what skills and competencies we're trying to build, and are there things that we can have as a big formalized, whether it's an e-learning course, a class, whether it's, you know, live, hybrid, what have you? Yes, let's have those, but are there elements in there that we can pluck out, reuse, redeploy in different ways? Maybe it's something in a mobile app, maybe it's some sort of activity or simulation that we can create that's smaller that we can throw out there. And so the idea of creating shorter videos that focus on specific concepts within the larger topic is a great way to do it. And so not only are you able to chunk up the pre-work and get that to fit in, but it's also the continuous piece after that. How can we keep dropping this stuff in so that people have it either when they want to access it, they think, oh, I need to know the answer to this, and they can look for it, or we're pushing it to them to say, don't forget. That kind of thing.
Yeah, we have to stop thinking of learning as an event, right? It's just a process. And so this is this big long timeline, and there's just different things that occur on the timeline that help that learning. But it's not all going to happen in that pre-work, and it's certainly not all going to happen in the live setting. It's just ongoing reinforcement, and that's just what learning is. So, you know, let's not consider like, oh, well, they have to all get into that one event. If you're thinking it that way, you've already lost the battle. Like, just ongoing reinforcement of concepts and principles.
Yeah, and that just continues to perpetuate the unfortunate perception of learning, as in a lot of organizations, that it is this intrusive thing that makes me have to stop my job so I can go do it.
Right.
And it can't be looked at like that. It has to work hand in hand with the job. It has to be a tool in your tool belt to help you do your job better.
Yeah, if that learning isn't helping with business outcomes, like, again, we've also lost the battle. Like, it's going to be defunded. It's going to be, you know, people are going to pull it. They're not going to have trust in you. You have to really focus on the business outcomes that are helpful. And if the learning isn't helping towards those ends, then it's not worth it.
Yep. Well, we have gone a little bit over the time, so I appreciate everyone sticking around, and I think we managed to answer everyone's questions as they came in and here at the end. So I really appreciate that. That's great. A lot of good questions and feedback coming through. Ben, obviously, thank you so much for bringing your insights and thoughts. Very, very glad to have you here, and a lot of insightful stuff. And of course, thanks to Class Technologies for giving us your time and the hour to put on the webinar. So thank you so much.
Yeah, glad to be here. It was great. Thank you.
Yeah, and so we look forward to seeing everybody on another webinar. You can still download the PDF in the handout section. If you didn't do that, or if you don't feel like it right now, or if you miss it, you will get an email within the next day that'll have a link not only to this recording, but you can then download the PDF there as well. So again, thanks everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.